In this video, I want to take a look at the political and philosophical implications of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America for our future, because I believe that we are in a social revolution that is the inverse of the one he described. And as a sort of mirror image, his work provides us with some useful insight into our conditions now. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French politician active from the 1830s to the 1850s. When he died of tuberculosis, like basically everyone else in that era. He came from an aristocratic family, some of whom met the guillotine, and others, including his parents, just narrowly escaped with their lives. He embarked on a political career in his early 20s, and in 1831, as a civil servant for France, he undertook a tour of the United States and Canada, the experiences of which provided the basis for his most famous work, Democracy in America, which was published in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840. This work is usually taken as an interesting document detailing American cultural and political institutions as they had developed by the mid-19th century. But I think it's worthwhile to see it as a work of political philosophy as well. It's a philosophic work. In his introductory chapter, which is what we're going to look at here, de Tocqueville presents his book as offering an answer to a political problem of his day. That problem being how to deal with the democratic revolution taking place in Europe in the wake of the French Revolution. He observes that it is an enormous social change that some are not yet sure of how to deal with. De Tocqueville himself is sympathetic to the old regime. He is sympathetic to aristocracy. Nevertheless, he takes the view that the social drive to democracy is inevitable, and his reason for this is that everything in society is tending toward a greater equality of conditions among people, and that this equality means that an aristocratic ordered society will be unsustainable, while a democratic ordered society is all but divinely ordained. That's the kind of language he uses to describe this historical process. Let's take a look at how he begins his work. Amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. I readily discovered the prodigious influence which this primary fact exercises on the whole course of society by giving a certain direction to public opinion and a certain tenor to the laws, by imparting new maxims to the governing powers and peculiar habits to the governed. I speedily perceived that the influence of this fact extends far beyond the political character and the laws of the country, and that it has no less empire over civil society than over the government. It creates opinions, engenders sentiments, suggests the ordinary practices of life, and modifies whatever it does not produce. The more I advanced in the study of American society, the more I perceived that the equality of conditions is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to be derived, and the central point at which all my observations constantly terminated. Later in this chapter, de Tocqueville describes equality of conditions, not just in America, but generally, as the, quote, efficient cause, using the Aristotelian term, of democratic laws and manners. This means that equality of conditions, in his view, produces democracy the way a father produces a child, or the way a carpenter produces a wooden table. And de Tocqueville sees this equality of conditions as the fact of life in Europe, not just in America. He goes on, I then turned my thoughts to our own hemisphere, where I imagined that I discerned something analogous to the spectacle which the New World presented to me. I observed that the equality of conditions is daily progressing towards those extreme limits which it seems to have reached in the United States, and that the democracy which governs the American communities appears to be rapidly rising into power in Europe. I hence conceived the idea of the book which is now before the reader. It is evident to all alike that a great democratic revolution is going on amongst us, but there are 2 opinions as to its nature and consequences. To some, it appears to be a novel accident, which as such may still be checked. To others, it seems irresistible, because it is the most uniform, the most ancient, and the most permanent tendency which is to be found in history. De Tocqueville makes it clear in his introductory chapter which side of this philosophic debate he is on. He believes it is irresistible. 700 years ago, he explains, France was aristocratic, and a few ruled the many by means of force and hereditary power. Landed property was the sole source of power. But another source of power arose in the form of the church, he says, because the ranks of the clergy were open to all classes, and men of the clergy could rise to high social rank. Later, business, or as we might say today, capitalism, opened another route to power. Intelligence became a source of power with the development of civilization. The privilege of birth declined in value. Power came from more than just land alone. And further developments of capitalism meant further development of equality of conditions among people. From the time when the exercise of the intellect became the source of strength and of wealth, it is impossible not to consider every addition to science, every fresh truth, and every new idea as a germ of power placed within the reach of the people. Poetry, eloquence, and memory, the grace of wit, the glow of imagination, the depth of thought, and all the gifts which are bestowed by Providence with an equal hand, turned to the advantage of the democracy. And even when they were in the possession of its adversaries, they still served its cause by throwing into relief the natural greatness of man. Its conquests spread, therefore, with those of civilization and knowledge, and literature became an arsenal where the poorest and the weakest could always find weapons to their hand. He refers to this development of equality of conditions as acting like a divine decree in that it is universal, it is enduring, and it is beyond human resistance. This means that democracy itself is coming and cannot be resisted. So de Tocqueville stakes his position in the philosophic debate of his time, and his position is democracy is going to be the future. What his book will try to do is offer us a way to direct that development, because democracy can take many forms. There's no reason it has to take this or that form. And there's no reason why we can't attempt to improve the kind of democracy we get. Here's how he puts it. The Christian nations of our age seem to me to present a most alarming spectacle. The impulse which is bearing them along is so strong that it cannot be stopped, but it is not yet so rapid that it cannot be guided. Their fate is in their hands. Yet a little while, and it may be so no longer. The first duty which is at this time imposed upon those who direct our affairs is to educate the democracy, to warm its faith, if that be possible, to purify its morals, to direct its energies, to substitute a knowledge of business for its inexperience, and an acquaintance with its true interest for its blind propensities, to adapt its government to time and place, and to modify it in compliance with the occurrences and the actors of the age. A new science of politics is indispensable to a new world. This, however, is what we think of least. Launched in the middle of a rapid stream, we obstinately fix our eyes on the ruins which may still be described upon the shore we have left, whilst the current sweeps us along and drives us backwards towards the gulf. Anticipating my later argument for a moment, that's where we are now. We are in the rapid stream of revolution, looking back at the empire of human rights, democracy, Western civilization, the U.S. Constitution, whatever it might be, things that we've known for 2 centuries, but we're leaving them behind. De Tocqueville observes that the democratic revolution in France has made rapid progress, but he compares its progress to that of a child who grew up in the streets and only knew the worst of what society had to offer and had no education except for being streetwise. Meaning the revolution had made material changes to society, but these changes were not yet reflected in laws, ideas, customs, and manners to really benefit the society. As a result, he says, we have a democracy, but we don't have those conditions which reduce its vices and make its natural advantages better. Note, the implication here is that any form of government, including democracy, has its good and its bad aspects, and that it's the business of the philosopher and the civil servant like himself to mitigate the bad features and to enhance and develop the good. In fact, this is what the founding fathers of America did. People often say that they were suspicious of democracy and put all these safeguards in to prevent against it. Well, yes. A better way of looking at it would be de Tocqueville's way, which is to say that they were aware that democracy as a form of government had good and bad aspects. And what they were doing was trying to maximize the good and minimize the bad. In fact, really the way they tried to set it up was not to establish it as a democracy per se, but to establish what Aristotle referred to as a mixed regime, meaning one which tried to moderate between elements of all political regimes and maintain their good aspects and reduce the bad ones. Just to give an example, a bad aspect of deliberative democracy is slowness in action, which in times of crisis or war can be a disaster. The presidency is therefore an institution which offers more or less monarchical power to avoid the weakness of democracy in times of crisis or war. So de Tocqueville's work observes that the world is trending toward equality of conditions, and that this trend makes the rise of democratic states inevitable, as if by divine decree, and most importantly, that it is early enough in the process of social revolution to guide the development of democracy to secure its advantages and avoid its worst excesses and difficulties. Now, my belief is that we are in the inverse situation today. For us, everything is tending toward greater inequality of conditions, and this inequality will make oligarchy or aristocracy inevitable in the future. Democracy, certainly liberal democracy, is doomed. Now, this is not a value judgment or a statement of my personal preference. Just as de Tocqueville was an old aristocrat who nevertheless saw that aristocracy was finished, I am in many ways a democratic sympathizer, but I see democracy as unsustainable into the future given several key factors that make growing inequality of conditions inescapable. There are two possibilities for our current order. It survives or it collapses. If it collapses, democracy will not survive a collapse situation in any meaningful large-scale sense. If it survives, there are three factors that make future inequality of conditions the efficient cause of an aristocratic or oligarchic state of things. The first factor is the complexity and fragility of the system. Our world is so interconnected and mutually interdependent by design that disruptions in one area can affect the whole. The system has a built-in capacity to absorb certain disruptions, but not others. Agitations on behalf of powerful, organized minority groups are normal, expected, and tolerable. Democratic agitations, meaning actual organized resistance from a majority or a large portion of the population, cannot be tolerated. Black Lives Matter protests are praised. Trucker convoys get the boot. And in fact, what happened in the latter case was that one of the most liberal democratic regimes of the West proved that it could and would turn democracy and human rights on and off like a tap whenever it wanted. Now, if they can do that, if the powerful can do that, democracy and human rights have no meaning. They are not inalienable. Indeed, they will be alienated by the state if you threaten the system. Any meaningful resistance from the people cannot and will not be allowed to happen. Black Lives Matter is not resistance because it is used by the system to enact things it already wanted to do. Same thing with other groups like Extinction Rebellion. These are not resistance movements. Democracy will not be allowed to threaten the system, meaning the people. But further, the system is also so complex that the majority can't really have a meaningful opinion about what could or should be done. This is a problem identified as long ago as 1922 by Walter Lippmann. Now, that's the era. The reason why that date is significant is because that's the era after World War I when the managerial class, as Burnham described it, was rising to power. The second factor leading to inequality of conditions is the welfare state. The welfare state has produced whole classes of people who are dependent upon government for their very survival, and the state encourages this. In fact, the state as it is developed is not just a welfare state, but a therapeutic state, as philosophers like Paul Gottfried have noted. The state sees itself as providing not only food, shelter, and clothing, but also mental and emotional support. It is looking upon the people as children that it must coddle through life. Children that one coddles through life are not your rulers. So there is a natural inequality in the relation of state to people. I think of things like how schools now provide grief counselors to students whenever a tragic event occurs. And essentially, the state is doing this on a broader scale for adult persons as well. In recent years, the number of people who depend upon the welfare state for more and more of their living has increased, and it will likely increase more in the future. A democratic state assumes an educated, self-reliant, and independent individual. That kind of state is not going to survive into a future when more than half the population is not this kind of person, when more than half of this population relies on government, and when the economy has less and less actual work for people to do. Already, countries are toying with ideas such as universal basic income and the like. So either the welfare state will expand to include more and more people whom the real economy cannot make use of, or the welfare state will have to be dismantled because we can't afford it, and the dismantling of it will require anti-democratic means just to maintain order. A third factor leading to inequality of conditions is the increasing division between haves and have-nots. And the basis of that division is intellect. The same intellect that de Tocqueville talked about as leading toward equality of conditions, it's now leading toward inequality. Because regardless of what de Tocqueville said, providence or nature does not distribute her gifts when it comes to intellect with an equal hand. Some have more than others. In our situation now, the system generates an enormous amount of wealth. This, because of the Pareto principle, is captured disproportionately by a few at the top. There really is no way to distribute this more equally. Wealth is too mobile to be captured, and those at the top have too many means by which to protect themselves legally and politically from any attempt to capture their wealth. Not, I would add, within a democratic system. A non-democratic system, like the Chinese or the Russian regimes have, they can and do check their billionaires from time to time. We, I believe, have reached a point where that cannot be done politically. But the division between haves and have-nots is not purely economic and material. As I said before, it's also mental. In the previous episode, I discussed James Burnham's managerial class. The managerial class of people is becoming increasingly bifurcated from the rest of society in terms of how they think. I've heard this bifurcation referred to as cloud people and dirt people. Cloud people are the ones who rule by means of their intellectual capacities, the managers and their admirers and their sycophants. And the dirt people are those who carry out the orders, who do the physical running of society, work which will probably be increasingly automated in the future. For various reasons, the ability of those from the dirt people class to rise to the cloud people class will become more limited in the future. But even if it isn't limited, part of being in the cloud people class is that you accept their worldview. But another factor that I've seen developing, and I think we've seen it on display quite clearly in recent years, is that the division in intellect among men means that some people are so susceptible to the propaganda and the unreal narratives which the cloud people necessarily produce to maintain some semblance of unity in the world, they can't see past that. They're not capable of thinking beyond that. Now, why do the cloud people produce this miasma of propaganda and unreal narratives, this hyperreality, as Adam Curtis's documentary calls it? Well, the old connections of community, race, culture, religion, and so on have been eradicated by liberal regimes. So something has to get people to come together, and that something is the ideology of the cloud people and their cultural product. Really what it is propaganda, ad hoc propaganda meant to keep people living in an unreal world that is easier to control. Basically, the way I see it is most people are normies. They will simply buy into the ideology and be slaves to the ideology, whatever the ideology is. They will be managed by corporate, university, state-run ideologies in the world as we have it now, and they're unable to get outside of that. Now, some few will be able to see things as they are outside of this particular ideology. And those who are able to do so will be dissidents who are marginalized and those who are able to run things. Incidentally, this is the situation in China now. The elites there are well educated in all the things that Western people know about. They're not necessarily slaves to the particular ideology of the ruling class. Nevertheless, they accept it and they use it to rule over the rest and feel entitled to rule. The inequality between the normie mindset and the non-normie mindset will produce different worlds. In other words, a fundamental inequality of conditions will exist, not only materially, but mentally, in terms of what people are capable of thinking and how they are capable of thinking. Most will exist in a dream world of hyperreality. How can such people have meaningful opinions on political matters? They can't. And I believe in the future, they won't. So we have these factors which are producing inequality of conditions among people now and into the future. A complex and fragile world which can't tolerate disruptions, an economic system which has no useful work for the majority to do, and in which the majority simply rely upon the rest for support, not unlike the old Roman system of patrons and clients, a social system within which a few direct and the rest obey, and a whole system sustained by an ideology that most cannot see past. We have already seen, as I discussed in a previous video, several attempts to produce a successor ideology to the one which supported capitalism and liberal democracy. I will now add that one problem with those successor ideologies is that they retain democratic trappings, which I believe are destined for the trash bin in a future in which human beings are increasingly unequal and their lives increasingly divided from one another. Now, if this is correct, and we are at the beginning of a transition to an aristocratic or oligarchic world order, we would do well to consider various things. What are some advantages of such an order which we could secure? What are disadvantages of that order which we can guard against? And not to put too fine a point on it, what can we get for selling things like our birthright to vote on our rulers? Because we technically still have that ability, but it's worth nothing to us, and we clearly are not going to be allowed to vote on anything other than what the oligarchic system in place wants. So what can we get for giving up the sham? De Tocqueville describes several advantages of what was, for him, the former aristocratic state of things. One advantage is the power of a nobility to restrict the tyranny of the princely ruler. For us, the princely ruler now is the state. And what people clearly want is someone like a based Elon Musk who goes against that. Now, we know that in reality, Elon Musk is in bed with the state and isn't based in any meaningful sense. But the fact that people want this shows that they want the situation de Tocqueville describes. That is, one in which there is some kind of nobility which can restrict the influence, the tyrannical power of the state. It's worth thinking about how such a situation could be created in the future within our existing structures. Another advantage de Tocqueville describes is a nobility which felt that care towards a people which a shepherd must feel towards his flock. This is key and provides us with an excellent model by which we can judge our current elites as miserable failures, because they clearly have contempt for the people, which is simply intolerable. Here I would say that it is worth thinking about what the difference is between a nobility, as de Tocqueville describes it, and the philanthropy of a William Fence. The difference, I believe, is a sense of mutual dependence. The shepherd needs the sheep. They provide him with something. William Fence merely gains the feeling of power from giving money away and affecting the world. He needs nothing from anyone he helps, and probably has zero personal connection to anyone he has ever helped. It is all done in the abstract. A concrete relationship between a nobility and a people is necessary. Our future elites must be both elevated above the people and one with them, not as it is now, one with each other but removed from the people. Another factor de Tocqueville talks about is that inequality can be degrading or it can be not degrading. What degrades men's souls, he says, is when there is inequality, but men exercise their power over others, knowing it to be illegal and usurped. I'll put this in another way. In modern terms, when Mark Zuckerberg wears a hoodie and pretends he's a man of the people, this is degrading. Because he's pretending, I'm just a normal person like everybody else, and I don't have power over others. He's pretending he lives in a world of equality of conditions, but he doesn't. That world doesn't really exist. And I would suggest that there is degradation in pretending to this kind of equality, just as there was once degradation in pretending to inequality. Already we're seeing the consequences of growing inequality. The governments of the West and Western elites are becoming increasingly illiberal and anti-democratic, and they're embracing ideologies and policies that weaken democratic and liberal norms. They are moving toward a post-democratic situation. But the situation is like de Tocqueville described. It is an oligarchy of a street urchin who has no refinement or education save practical cunning. Now, if the coming era is going to be non-democratic, as I believe conditions ensure it will be, we will gain a serious advantage by trying to shape and direct that era at its outset rather than trying to rein in its worst excesses once it is already here. I do know this one thing for sure. Whoever the elites who govern a future oligarchy or aristocracy will be, they cannot be like the elites who govern now, who are fitted for managing expectations within a hyper-real world, but not for governing the functioning of a real world, or for treating the mass of humanity with anything like the care which a true aristocracy should feel. In other words, our elites are those produced by a mercantile and democratic regime in its dotage, and they are adapted to succeeding in such a system. They are dreamers and psychopaths. They are inhuman and cannot be trusted with power. We need to take consideration for the development of a new elite. We need shepherds and not managers.